Part 12. White World Again. 1. A Preface to Mutiny. I emerged from Red China to find a sharpening tension between the Dongbei troops of young Marshal Zhang Xueliang and Generalissimo Jiang Kai-Shek, who was now not only Commander-in-Chief of China's armed forces, but also Chairman of the Executive Yuan, a position comparable to that of Premier. I have described how the Dongbei troops were gradually being transformed, militarily and politically, from mercenaries who'd been shipped to half a dozen different provinces to fight the Reds, into an army infected by the national, patriotic, anti-Japanese slogans of its enemy, convinced of the futility of continued civil war, stirred by only one exhortation, loyal to but one central idea, the hope of fighting back to the old homeland, of recovering Manchuria from the Japanese who had driven them from their homes and abused and murdered their families. These notions being directly opposed to the maxims then held by Nanjing, the Dongbei troops had found themselves with a growing fellow feeling for the anti-Japanese Red Army. The estrangement had been widened by important occurrences during the 4 months of my travels. In the southwest, a revolt against Nanjing had been led by Generals Bai Zhongxi and Li Congren, whose chief political demands were based on opposition to the nationalist government's non-resistance policies. After weeks of near war, a compromise settlement had finally been reached, but the interim had provided a tremendous stimulus to the anti-Japanese movement throughout China. 3 or 4 Japanese had been killed by angry mobs in various parts of the interior, and Japan had presented to Nanjing strong demands for apologies, compensations, and new political concessions. Another Sino-Japanese incident, followed by a Japanese invasion, seemed a possibility. Meanwhile, the anti-Japanese movement, led by the left-wing National Salvation Association, was, despite stern measures of suppression, rising in strength everywhere, and considerable mass pressure was being indirectly exerted on Nanjing to stiffen its attitude. Such pressure multiplied when, in October, Japanese-led Mongol and Chinese puppet troops, equipped and trained in Japan's conquered Jiehol and Chaha, began an invasion of northern Xi'an, Inner Mongolia. But the widespread popular demand that this be considered the last extremity and the signal for a war of resistance on a national scale was ignored. No mobilization orders were forthcoming. Nanjing's standing reply remained: internal unification, i.e. extermination of the Reds, must come first. Many patriotic quarters began to urge that the communist proposals for an end to civil war and the creation of a national front on the basis of voluntary unification be accepted by Nanjing, in order to concentrate the entire energies of the people to oppose the common peril of Japan. Proponents of such opinions were arrested as traitors. The highest degree of emotional excitement centered in the northwest. Few people realized then how closely the anti-Japanese sentiment of the Dongbei army was connected with the determination to stop the war against the Reds. Xi'an seemed a long way off to most Chinese, as well as to foreigners in the big treaty ports of China, and it was little visited by journalists. An exception was Miss Nim Wales, an American writer who in October journeyed to Xi'an and interviewed the young marshal. Miss Wales reported, "The serious anti-Japanese movement in China is formulating itself not in the various incidents ranging from north to south, but here in Xianfu among the northern exiles from Manchuria, as one might expect that it logically should. While the movement is being suppressed in other parts of China, in Xianfu it is under the open and enthusiastic leadership of young Marshal Zhang Xueliang, ardently supported by his troops, if not compelled by them, to act in this direction." Reflecting the significance of her interview with the young marshal, Miss Wales wrote, "In effect, and read in relation to its background, this interview may be interpreted as an attempt to influence Jiang Kai-Shek to lead active resistance, implying a threat in his statement that only by resistance to foreign aggression, i.e. not by civil war, can the real unification of China be manifested, and that if the government does not obey the will of the people, it cannot stand. Most significant, this deputy commander-in-chief, second only to Jiang Kai-Shek, said that if the communists can sincerely cooperate to resist the common foreign invader, perhaps it is possible that this problem can be settled peacefully." But Jiang Kai-Shek plainly underestimated the seriousness of the warning. In October he sent the First Army, his best, to attack the Reds in Gansu, and when he arrived in Xianfu it was for the purpose of completing preliminary plans for the 6th General Offensive against the Reds. In Xi'an and Lanzhou, arrangements were made to accommodate more than 100 bombers. Tons of bombs arrived. It was reported that poison gas was to be used. This was seemingly the only explanation of Chiang's queer boast that he would destroy the remnant Red bandits in a couple of weeks, or at most a month. There was one thing that Chiang must have understood after his October visit to Xi'an. That was that the Dongbei troops were becoming useless in the war against the communists. In interviews with Dongbei commanders, the Generalissimo could now discern a profound lack of interest in his new offensive. One of Zhang Xueliang's staff later told me that at this time, the young marshal formally presented to the Generalissimo the program for a national front, cessation of civil war, alliance with Russia, and resistance to Japan. Jiang Kai-Shek replied, "I will never talk about this until every red soldier in China is exterminated and every communist is in prison. Only then would it be possible to cooperate with Russia." A little before this, the Generalissimo had rejected a Russian offer of a mutual defense pact through his foreign minister, Wang Jingwei. Now the Generalissimo went back to his headquarters in Luoyang and supervised preparations for his new campaign. 20 divisions of troops were to be brought into the northwest if necessary. By late November, over 10 full war-strength divisions had already been concentrated near Dongguan, outside the historic pass of the gateway to Shanxi. Trainloads of shells and supplies poured into Xi'an. Tanks, armoured cars, motor transports were prepared to move after them. A flame of strong nationalist feeling swept through the country, and the Japanese demanded the suppression of the National Salvation Movement, which they held responsible for the anti-Japanese agitation. Nanjing obliged. 7 of the most prominent leaders of the organization, all respectable citizens, including a prominent banker, a lawyer, educators, and writers, were arrested. At the same time, the government suppressed 14 nationally popular magazines. Strikes on the Japanese mills of Shanghai, partly in patriotic protest against the Japanese invasion of Xueliang, were also broken up with considerable violence by the Japanese, in cooperation with the Kuomintang. When other patriotic strikes occurred in Qingdao, the Japanese landed their own marines, arrested the strikers, occupied the city. The marines were withdrawn only after Chiang had agreed virtually to prohibit all strikes in Japanese mills of Qingdao in the future. All those happenings had further repercussions in the northwest. In November, under pressure from his own officers, Zhang Xueliang dispatched his famous appeal to be sent to the Xueyuan front. "In order to control our troops," this missive concluded, "we should keep our promise to them that whenever the chance comes, they will be allowed to carry out their desire of fighting the enemy. Otherwise they will regard not only myself, but also your Excellency as a cheat, and thus will no longer obey us. Please give us the order to mobilize at least a part, if not the whole, of the Dongbei army, to march immediately to Xueyuan as reinforcements to those who are fulfilling their sacred mission of fighting Japanese imperialism there. If so, I, as well as my troops of more than 100,000, shall follow your Excellency's leadership to the end." The earnest tone of this whole letter, the hope of restoring an army's lost prestige, were overwhelmingly evident. But Chiang rejected the suggestion. He still wanted the Dongbei army to fight the Reds. Not long afterwards, importunate, the marshal flew his plane to Luoyang to repeat the request in person. At this time also he interceded for the arrested leaders of the National Salvation Association. Later on, after the arrest of the Generalissimo, Zhang Xueliang recounted that conversation. "Recently, the Generalissimo Chiang arrested and imprisoned 7 of our National Salvation leaders in Shanghai. I asked him to release those leaders. Now none of the National Salvation leaders are my friends or relatives, and I do not even know most of them, but I protested at their arrest because their principles are the same as mine. My request that they be released was rejected. To Jiang I then said, 'Your cruelty in dealing with the patriotic movement of the people is exactly the same of Yuan Shikai or Zhang Tongzhang.' Generalissimo Chiang replied, 'That is merely your viewpoint. I am the government. My action was that of a revolutionary.' Fellow countrymen, do you believe this?" The question was answered by an angry roar from the assembled thousands. But Zhang Xueliang's flight to Luoyang at that time had one positive result. The Generalissimo agreed that when he next came to Xi'an, he would explain his plans and strategy to the Dongbei division generals in detail. The young marshal returned to await impatiently his superior's second visit. Before Jiang arrived, however, 2 occurrences intervened which further antagonized the northwest. The first of these was the signing of the German-Japanese anti-communist agreement, and Italy's unofficial adherence thereto. Italy had already tacitly recognized Japan's conquests of Manchuria, in return for which Japan had acknowledged Italy's control of Abyssinia. The opening of Italian relations with Manchu Kuo had infuriated the young marshal, who had once been pals with Count Xi'an. With receipt of this news, he denounced both Xi'an and Mussolini and swore to destroy Italian influence in his country. "This is absolutely the end of the fascist movement in China," he exclaimed in a speech before his cadets. Then, in November also, came the news of the disaster to Hu Zongnan's famed First Army, which on the 21st suffered a severe defeat from the Reds. General Hu, ablest of Nanjing's tacticians, had for weeks been moving almost unimpeded into northern Gansu. The Reds had slowly withdrawn, refusing battle except in minor skirmishes. But in various ways, they propagandized the Nanjing troops about the United Front, trying to persuade them to halt, issuing declarations that the Red Army would attack no anti-Japanese troops, urging the enemy to join them in resisting Japan. Chinese must not fight Chinese. The propaganda was to prove highly effective. General Hu pushed on. The Reds continued to withdraw until they had almost reached Xueliang. Then they decided to retreat no further. The enemy needed a lesson. It needed to be shown that a united front also had teeth in it. Suddenly turning, they skillfully maneuvered General Hu's troops into a valley of Loess land, surrounded them at dusk when the air bombardment had ceased, and at night staged a surprise frontal attack supported by bayonet charges from both flanks. It was zero weather, and the Reds' bare hands were so cold they could not pull the caps from their hand grenades. Hundreds of them went into the enemy lines using their potato masher grenades for clubs. The fierce onslaught led by the 1st Army Corps resulted in the complete destruction and disarming of 2 infantry brigades and a regiment of cavalry, while thousands of rifles and machine guns were captured, and 1 government regiment turned over intact to join the Reds. General Hu beat a hasty retreat, giving up in a few days all the territory which he had recovered over a period of weeks. The Dongbei generals must have been amused. Was it not just as they had said? Did not the Reds have more punch in them than ever? Did not this inauspicious beginning of a new campaign show how difficult the process of annihilation was going to be? A year, 2 years, 3, and where would they be? Still fighting the Reds? And Japan? In occupation of new and greater areas of Chinese territory. But the obstinate Generalissimo, angered by the humiliation of his best army, censured General Hu, and only became more determined to destroy his 10-year enemy. Into this main theatre of events, General Jiang Kai-Shek stepped from his aeroplane on the flying field of Xi'an on December 7th, 1936. Meanwhile, important things had happened on both the right and left wings of the stage. Among the Dongbei commanders, an agreement had been reached to present a common request for cancellation of civil war and resistance to Japan. Into this agreement had come the officers of the army of General Yang Hucheng, the pacification commissioner of Shanxi. General Yang's army, of about 40,000 men, had even less interest in continuing the war against the Reds than the Dongbei troops. To them it was Nanjing's war, and they saw no good reason for wrecking themselves against the Reds, many of whom were Shanxi people like themselves. It was to them also a disgraceful war, when Japan was invading the neighbouring province of Xueliang. General Yang's troops, known as the Xibei Zhun, or the Northwest Army, had some months previously formed a close solidarity with the Dongbei troops, and secretly joined in the truce with the Reds. The substance of all that surely must have been known to the Premier Generalissimo. Although he had no regular troops in Xi'an, a few months earlier some 1,500 of the 3rd Gendarmes, a so-called special service regiment of the Blue Shirts, General Zhang Xiaoxian, who was credited with the abduction, imprisonment and killing of hundreds of radicals, had arrived in the city. They had established espionage headquarters throughout the province, and had begun to kidnap alleged communist students, political workers, and soldiers. Shao Lizi, the Nanjing-appointed governor of Shanxi, was in control of the police force of the capital. As neither the young marshal nor Yang Hucheng had any troops but bodyguards in the city, the Generalissimo had practical command there. This situation helped to provoke a further incident. On the 9th, 2 days after Zhang's arrival, several thousand students held an anti-Japanese demonstration and started to march to Lindong to present a petition to the Generalissimo. Governor Shao ordered it to be dispersed. The police, assisted by some of Jiang Kai-Shek's gendarmes, handled the students roughly, and at one stage opened fire on them. 2 students were wounded, and as they happened to be children of a Dongbei officer, the shooting was especially inflammatory. Zhang Xueliang intervened, stopped the fight, persuaded the students to return to the city, and agreed to present their petition to the Generalissimo. Infuriated, Jiang Kai-Shek reprimanded Zhang for his disloyalty in trying to represent both sides. Jiang Kai-Shek himself wrote that he considered this incident between them the immediate cause of the revolt. So, despite all the objections and warnings, the Generalissimo summoned a General Staff Congress on the 10th, when final plans were formally adopted to push ahead with the 6th campaign. A general mobilization order was prepared for the Xibei, Dongbei, and Nanjing troops already in Gansu and Shanxi, together with the Nanjing troops waiting in Dongguan. It was announced that the order would be published on the 12th. It was openly stated that if Marshal Zhang refused these orders, his troops would be disarmed by the Nanjing forces, and he himself would be dismissed from his command. General Jiang Dingwen had already been appointed to replace Zhang Xueliang as head of the Bandit Suppression Commission. At the same time, reports reached both Zhang and Yang that the blue shirts, together with the police, had prepared a black list of communist sympathizers in their armies who were to be arrested immediately after publication of the mobilization order. Thus it was at the culmination of this complicated chain of events that Zhang Xueliang called a joint meeting of the division commanders of the Dongbei and Xibei armies at 10 o'clock on the night of December the 11th. Orders had been secretly given on the previous day for a division of Dongbei troops and a regiment of Yang Hucheng's army to move into the environs of Xianfu. The decision was now taken to use these forces to arrest the Generalissimo and his staff. The mutiny of 170,000 troops had become a fact. 2. The Generalissimo is arrested. Whatever we may say against its motives or the political energies behind them, it must be admitted that the coup de théâtre enacted at Xi'an was brilliantly timed and executed. No word of the rebels' plans reached their enemies until too late. By 6 o'clock on the morning of December the 12th, the whole affair was over. Dongbei and Xibei troops were in control of Xi'an. The blue shirts, surprised in their sleep, had been disarmed and arrested. Practically the whole general staff had been surrounded in its quarters at the Xi'an guest house and was imprisoned. Governor Shao Lizi and the chief of police were also prisoners. The city police force had surrendered to the mutineers, and 50 Nanjing bombers and their pilots had been seized at the airfield. But the arrest of the Generalissimo was a bloodier affair. Jiang Kai-Shek was staying 10 miles from the city at Lingdong, a famous hot springs resort, which had been cleared of all other guests. To Lingdong at midnight went 26-year-old Captain Sun Mingqiu, commander of the young marshal's bodyguard. Halfway there he picked up 200 Dongbei troops, and at 3 a.m. drove to the outskirts of Lingdong. There they waited till 5 o'clock, when the first truck, with about 15 men, roared up to the hotel, was challenged by sentries, and opened fire. Reinforcements soon arrived for the Dongbei vanguard, and Captain Sun led an assault on the Generalissimo's residence. Taken by complete surprise, the bodyguards put up a short fight, long enough, however, to permit the astounded Generalissimo to escape. When Captain Sun reached Zhang's bedroom, he had already fled. Sun took a search party up the side of the rocky, snow-covered hill behind the resort. Presently they found the Generalissimo's personal servant, and not long afterwards came upon the man himself, clad only in a loose robe thrown over his nightshirt, his bare feet and hands cut in his nimble flight up the mountain. Shaking in the bitter cold, and minus his false teeth, he was crouching in a cave beside a great rock. Sun Mingqiu hailed him, and the Generalissimo's first words were, "If you are my comrade, shoot me and finish it all." To which Sun replied, "We will not shoot. We only ask that you lead our country against Japan." Zhang remained seated on his rock, and said with difficulty, "Call Marshal Zhang here. I will come down." "Marshal Zhang isn't here. The troops are risen in the city. We came to protect you." At this the Generalissimo seemed much relieved, and called for a horse to take him down the mountain. "There is no horse here," said Sun, "but I will carry you down the mountain on my back." And he knelt at Zhang's feet. After some hesitation, Zhang accepted, and climbed painfully onto the broad back of the young officer. They proceeded solemnly down the slope in this fashion, escorted by troops, until a servant arrived with Zhang's shoes. The little group got into a car at the foot of the hill, and set off for Xi'an. "The past is the past," Sun said to him. "From now on there must be a new policy for China. What are you going to do? The one urgent task for China is to fight Japan. This is the special demand of the men of the northeast. Why do you not fight Japan, but instead give the order to fight the Red Army?" "I am the leader of the Chinese people," Zhang shouted. "I represent the nation. I think my policy is correct." In this way, a little bloody but unbowed, the Generalissimo arrived in the city, where he became the involuntary guest of General Yang Hucheng and the young marshal. On the day of the coup, all division commanders of the Dongbei and Xibei armies signed and issued a circular telegram addressed to the central government, to various provincial leaders, and to the people at large. The brief missive explained that, in order to stimulate his awakening, the Generalissimo had been requested to remain for the time being in Xianfu. Meanwhile, his personal safety was guaranteed. The demands of national salvation submitted to the Generalissimo were broadcast to the nation, but everywhere suppressed in the Kuomintang censored newspapers. Here are the rebels' 8 points. 1. Reorganize the Nanjing government and admit all parties to share the joint responsibility of national salvation. 2. End all civil war immediately and adopt the policy of armed resistance against Japan. 3. Release the 7 leaders of the patriotic movement in Shanghai. 4. Pardon all political prisoners. 5. Guarantee the people liberty of assembly. 6. Safeguard the people's rights of patriotic organization and political liberty. 7. Put into effect the will of Dr. Sun Yat-sen. 8. Immediately convene a National Salvation Conference. To this program, the Chinese Red Army, the Chinese Soviet government, and the Communist Party of China immediately offered their support. A few days later, Zhang Xueliang sent to Bao'an his personal plane, which returned to Xi'an with 3 Red delegates: Zhou Enlai, Vice Chairman of the Military Council, Ye Jianying, Chief of Staff of the East Front Army, and Bo Gu, Chairman of the Northwest Branch of the Soviet government. A joint meeting was called between the Dongbei, Xibei, and Red Army delegates, and the 3 groups became open allies. On the 14th, an announcement was issued on the formation of a united anti-Japanese army, consisting of about 130,000 Dongbei troops, 40,000 Xibei troops, and approximately 90,000 troops of the Red Army. Jiang Xueliang was elected chairman of a united anti-Japanese military council, and Yang Hucheng vice chairman. Dongbei troops under General Yu Zedong had on the 12th carried out a coup of their own against the central government officials and troops in Lanzhou, capital of Gansu province, and had disarmed the Nanjing garrison there. In the rest of Gansu, the Reds and the Manchurian troops together held control of all main communications, surrounding about 50,000 Nanjing troops in that province, so that the rebels had effective power in all Shaanxi and Gansu. Immediately after the incident, Dongbei and Xibei troops moved eastward to the Shaanxi, Xiangxi, and Shaanxi-Henan borders, on instructions from the new council. From the same council, the Red Army took orders to push southward. Within a week, the Reds had moved their capital to Yan'an City, and occupied virtually the whole of northern Shaanxi above the Wei River. A Red vanguard under Peng Dehuai was located at Sanyuan, a city only 30 miles from Xianfu. Another contingent of 10,000 Reds under Xu Haidong was preparing to move over to the Shaanxi-Henan border. The Red, northeastern, and northwestern troops stood shoulder to shoulder along the Shaanxi border. While the defensive arrangements proceeded, all 3 armies issued clear-cut statements declaring their opposition to a new internal war. Steps were taken at once to carry out the 8 points. All orders for war against the Reds were cancelled. More than 400 political prisoners in Xianfu were released. Censorship of the press was removed, and all suppression of patriotic and anti-Japanese organizations was lifted. Hundreds of students were freed to work among the populace, building United Front organizations in every class. They toured into the villages also, where they began to train and arm the farmers, politically and militarily. In the army, the political workers conducted an unprecedented anti-Japanese campaign. Mass meetings were summoned almost daily. But news of those happenings was suppressed outside the provinces of the northwest. Editors who dared publish anything emanating from Xi'an, as even the highly respectable Da Gongbao pointed out, were threatened with instant arrest. Meanwhile, Nanjing's propaganda machine threw out a smokescreen that further confused an already befuddled public. Dumbfounded by the news, the government at Nanjing first called a meeting of the Standing Committee, of the Central Executive Committee, and the Central Political Council of the Kuomintang, which promptly pronounced Zhang Xueliang a rebel, dismissed him from his posts, and demanded the release of the Generalissimo, failing which punitive operations would begin. For 3 days, few people knew whether Jiang Kai-Shek was dead or alive, except the Associated Press, which flatly announced that Zhang Xueliang had described over the radio how and why he had killed him. Few people knew exactly what the rebels planned to do. Nanjing cut all communications with the northwest, and its papers and manifestos were burned by the censors. Hundreds of words were deleted from my own dispatches. I made several attempts to send out the 8 demands of the northwest, which might have helped a little to clarify the enigma for Western readers, but the censors let out not a word. Many of the foreign correspondents were themselves completely ignorant of recent happenings in the northwest. While real news and facts were rigorously suppressed, the Kuomintang and its adherents released to the world some puerile lies which made China appear much more of a madhouse than it really was. The rebels had nailed the chief of police to the city gates. The Reds had occupied Xi'an, were looting the city and flying red banners on the walls. Zhang Xueliang had been assassinated by his own men. Almost daily it was stated by Nanjing that riots were taking place in Xi'an. The Reds were abducting young boys and girls. Women were being communized. The entire Dongbei and Xibei armies had turned bandit. There was looting everywhere. Zhang Xueliang was demanding $80 million ransom for the Generalissimo. Many of the wildest rumors circulated have their origins also with the Japanese press in China, and even with high Japanese officials. The Japanese were especially fertile with imaginary eyewitness reports of the Red Menace in Xi'an. The Japanese also discovered Soviet-Russian intrigue behind the coup, but they met their masters in propaganda in Moscow's press. Izvestia and Pravda went so far in their official disclaimers of responsibility, denunciations of Zhang Xueliang, and hosannas to Jiang Kai-Shek that they invented a story showing that the Xi'an affair was jointly inspired by the former Chinese premier Wang Jingwei and the Japanese imperialists, a libel so antipodal to the facts that even the most reactionary press in China had not dared to suggest it out of fear of ridicule. Prevarication is permissible, gentlemen, it was Lenin who once exclaimed, but within limits. After the first week of Zhang's captivity, Nanjing's efforts to cork up the facts proved inadequate. Leaks occurred, and then big gaps. The 8-point program was widely published in the surreptitious press, and the public began to realize that the Northwest did not mean to make civil war, but to stop it. Sentiment slowly began to change from fear for the safety of an individual militarist into fear for the safety of the state. Civil war now could not save Zhang, but it might ruin China. Intrigue for seizure of power had begun in Nanjing with the news of Zhang's capture. Ambitious War Minister He Yingqian, closely affiliated with the pro-Japanese political science clique of the Kuomintang, then in high office at Nanjing, and against whom the 8-point program was primarily directed, was hot for a punitive expedition. In this, General He was fully supported by the pro-fascist Huangpu clique, with the Blue Shirts, the Wang Jingwei out of office faction, the Western Hills Group, the CC faction, and Nanjing's German and Italian advisors. Their enemies said that they all saw in the situation an opportunity to seize power, relegating the liberal, pro-American, pro-British, pro-Russian and United Front groups in the Kuomintang to political non-entity. General He mobilized 20 Nanjing divisions and moved them toward the Henan-Shanxi border. He sent squadrons of aeroplanes roaring over Xianfu and made tentative thrusts at the rebels' lines with his infantry. Some of the Nanjing planes, anti-Japanese 50th birthday gifts to the Generalissimo, experimentally bombed Weinan and Huaxian inside the Shanxi border and reportedly killed a number of factory workers. The big question now became this: whether Jiang Kai-Shek could, even from his seat of captivity in Xi'an, still muster enough support in Nanjing to prevent the outbreak of an exhausting war which was likely to mean his own political, if not physical, demise. In Nanjing and Shanghai, his brothers-in-law, T.V. Sun, chairman of the Central Bank of China, and H.H. Gong, acting premier, and Madame Zhang, rallied Zhang's personal followers and worked frantically to prevent the more reactionary elements in Nanjing from initiating an offensive in the name of an anti-communist punitive expedition. Meanwhile, swift changes of heart were taking place in Xi'an. Soon after his capture, the Generalissimo had begun to realize that perhaps his worst betrayers were not in Xi'an, but in Nanjing. Contemplating this situation, Jiang Kai-Shek must have decided that he did not choose to be the martyr over whose dead body General He Yingjin or anyone else would climb to dictatorial power. 3. Jiang, Zhang, and the Reds. China was no parliamentary democracy, but was ruled by party or individual dictators. Very often in politics it reverted to feudal practice. With the press completely stifled and the populace disfranchised, there was but one effective way to censure Nanjing or alter its policies. That was by armed insurrection or armed demonstration, or what the Chinese call bingjian, military persuasion, a recognized tactic in Chinese political maneuver. Zhang Xueliang probably chose the most humane and direct method conceivable by which to achieve his purpose when he used direct action upon the head of the dictatorship. It cost a minimum loss of life and a minimum of bloodshed. It was a feudal method, but the marshal was dealing with a personality whose role in semi-feudal politics he intuitively understood. Because the objective result of Zhang's action was to unite China to confront a national peril, most Chinese I knew came to regard Zhang as a patriot. Was Jiang Kai-Shek's life ever really in serious danger? It appears that it was. Not from the young marshal, and not from the Reds. From Yang Hucheng, possibly. But most certainly from the radical younger officers of the northeastern and northwestern armies, from the discontented and mutinous soldiery, and from the organised and arming masses, all of whom demanded a voice in the disposal of the Premier. Resolutions passed by the young officers called for a mass trial of traitor Jiang and all his staff. The mood of the army decidedly favoured the Generalissimo's immolation. Curiously enough, it fell to the lot of the communists to persuade them that his life should be saved. Communist policy throughout the Xi'an incident was never clearly explained. Many people assumed that the communists, in triumphant revenge for the decade of relentless war which Jiang Kai-Shek had waged against them, would now demand his death. Many believed that they would use this opportunity to coalesce with the Dongbei and Xibei armies, greatly enlarge their base, and challenge Nanjing in a great new struggle for power. Instead, they not only urged a peaceful settlement and the release of Jiang Kai-Shek, but also his return to leadership in Nanjing. Even Madame Jiang wrote that, quite contrary to outside beliefs, they, the Reds, were not interested in detaining the Generalissimo. But why not? Economically, politically, militarily, in every way they really needed internal peace. The victory of the Chinese national liberation movement, said Mao Zedong, will be part of the victory of world socialism, because to defeat imperialism in China means the destruction of one of its most powerful bases. If China wins its independence, the world revolution will progress very rapidly. If our country is subjugated by the enemy, we shall lose everything. For a people being deprived of its national freedom, the revolutionary task is not immediate socialism, but the struggle for independence. We cannot even discuss communism if we are robbed of a country in which to practice it. Thus it was fundamentally on this thesis that the Communists based their United Front proposals to the Kuomintang, even before the capture of the Generalissimo. In that crisis they recognized an opportunity to demonstrate the sincerity of their offer. If they had nothing to do with the arrest of Chiang Kai-shek, they had much to do with its denouement. Immediately after hearing of the event, the Soviet government and the Communist Party called a joint meeting, at which it was decided to support the 8-point program and to participate in the United Anti-Japanese Council. Soon afterwards they issued a circular telegram expressing the belief that the Xi'an leaders acted with patriotic sincerity and zeal, wishing speedily to formulate a national policy of immediate resistance to Japan. The telegram strongly condemned He Yingjin's punitive expedition, declaring that, if civil war is launched, the whole nation will be plunged into complete chaos. The Japanese robbers, taking advantage of this, will invade our nation, and enslavement will be our fate. To secure a peaceful settlement, the Reds urged that the negotiations be opened on the basis of no war, and the summoning of a peace conference of all parties, at which would be discussed the program of united national resistance to Japan. The telegram clearly indicated the policy followed out by the Red delegates, whom Marshal Zhang summoned to Xi'an. Shortly after his arrival, the head of the communist delegation, Zhou Enlai, went to see Jiang Kai-shek. One could easily imagine the effect of this meeting on the Generalissimo. Still physically weak and psychologically deeply shaken by his experiences, Jiang was said to have turned pale with apprehension when Zhou Enlai, his former political attaché, for whose head he had once offered $80,000, entered the room and gave him a friendly greeting. He must have at once concluded that the Red Army had entered Xi'an and that he was to be turned over to it as a captive. Such a fear had troubled the comely head of Madame Chiang Kai-shek, who said that she felt the objective, if Zhang were removed from Xi'an, would be somewhere behind red lines. But the Generalissimo was relieved of this apprehension by Zhou and the Marshal, both of whom acknowledged him as the Commander-in-Chief, and sat down to explain the attitude of the Communists towards the national crisis. At first frigidly silent, Jiang gradually thawed and listened for the first time during his decade of war against the Communists to their proposals for ending civil war. By December 20th, general agreement in principle seemed to have already been reached. The following excerpts from the statement issued to the foreign press by Marshal Zhang Xueliang on the 19th indicated that he at least regarded the settlement as virtually complete. The Generalissimo's prolonged stay here is not of our doing. As soon as Mr. Donald arrived last Monday and the Generalissimo had somewhat recovered from his natural indignation and his reluctance to talk, he calmly enough discussed the problem confronting us all, and by Tuesday had agreed in principle with the points we had in view, and in accordance with the will of the late Dr. Sun Yat-sen. I therefore telegraphed, welcoming anyone to come from Nanjing to hear the Generalissimo's views, and arrange with him the necessary safeguards to prevent the development of civil warfare. The Generalissimo naturally vigorously demanded that he be released to proceed to Nanjing. But while I personally had full confidence that the Generalissimo would carry out his promises, it was impossible to risk his being persuaded after his arrival at Nanjing to continue with the warfare. He acquiesced in the view, however, and ever since then he has been waiting in vain, as have we, for someone to arrive from Nanjing competent to deal with the matter, i.e. offer adequate guarantees, so that the Generalissimo can return to the capital. That is all. It is a strange thing that there has been this delay. Had someone come, he could have returned some days ago. Xueliang. But serious trouble was developing in the ranks of the radical younger officers of the Dongbei army. They had acquired strong direct voice in the affairs of Zhang's military council, and their views were important. Infected by the temper of the strong mass movement now spreading throughout the northwest, they were at first fiercely opposed to the release of Jiang Kai-Shek before Nanjing began to carry out the 8-point program. The majority, in fact, insisted upon giving Jiang a popular trial for his life before an enormous mass meeting which they planned to call. The possibility of this public humiliation had also occurred to Jiang. No one knew any better than he the potentialities of the movement that had been set afoot in the northwest, for a similar rising had almost overwhelmed him in 1927. Jiang's whole career had been a struggle against the intervention in his well-ordered chain of events of that disturbing imperative to which he called the mob. Talk of the popular trial was even on the lips of the sentries around him. Jiang wrote of listening through the doorway to the conversation of his jailers, in which his fate was discussed. When I heard the words, "the people's verdict," I realized that it was a malicious plot to kill me by using the mob as their excuse. Jiang Kai-Shek may have been saved from further humiliation only by the communists' opposition to any such plan. Even before Zhou's talk with Zhang, the communists had begun to state that they had received enough assurances from him, aside from assurances to be inferred from the objective situation, to believe that if released he would be obliged to stop civil war and in general to carry out the whole United Front program. But to do so, Jiang's position had to be preserved, and he must return to Nanjing with his prestige intact. If he was submitted to the indignity of a people's trial, civil war would inevitably develop. The decade of stalemate in the Red Kuomintang War would be very much prolonged, and hopes of achieving an anti-Japanese national front would become remote indeed. From such a prospect no party could hope to benefit. Only China could suffer, and only Japan gain. So at least the Reds explained their policy to me. By December the 22nd, several envoys and negotiators from the central government had arrived in Xi'an, including T.V. Song, chairman of the National Economic Council, and Zhang's brother-in-law, the Minister of Interior, the Vice Minister of War, the President of the Military Advisory Council, the Chief Aide-de-Camp of the Generalissimo, as well as assorted members of the General Staff who had been detained with Jiang Kai-Shek. Most of them took some part of the parleys with Zhang Xueliang, Yang Hucheng, Zhou Enlai, and High Commissioners of the Dongbei Army. The substantial meaning of the 8 demands to those who supported them was, in correct order of importance, as follows. 1. Cessation of civil war and cooperation between the Kuomintang and the Communists in 2. A definite policy of armed resistance against any further Japanese aggression. 3. Dismissal of certain pro-Japanese officials in Nanjing and the adoption of an active diplomacy for creating closer relations, alliances if possible, with Great Britain, America, and Soviet Russia. 4. Reorganization of the Dongbei and Xibei armies on an equal footing, politically and militarily, with Nanjing's forces. 5. Greater political freedom for the people. And 6. The creation of some sort of democratic political structure at Nanjing. Those seem to be the main points of agreement between Jiang Kai-Shek and Zhang Xueliang before they left Xi'an. Jiang also made a personal guarantee that there would be no more civil war. It is certain that Jiang Kai-Shek was quite honest in saying that he signed no document, and there is no evidence to support any claims that he did. But although Nanjing and the Generalissimo still had their face, subsequent events were to show that the young marshal had not lost his entirely in vain. The arrival of Madame Jiang on the 22nd no doubt hastened the termination of these interviews, and, as in her lively account of her 3 days in Xi'an she made abundantly clear, her own importunity and scolding of Zhang Xueliang speeded up the Generalissimo's release. Just as her husband compared himself with Jesus Christ on the cross, so also Madame Jiang recognized herself in a biblical role, quoting, "Jehovah will now do a new thing, and that is, he will make a woman protect a man." On the 25th, when Madame Jiang was wistfully wondering if Santa Claus would pass by Xi'an, old Saint Nick appeared in the person of Zhang Xueliang, who announced that he had won all the arguments with his officers. He would that day fly them back to Nanjing. And he did. Finally, there was that last and flabbergasting gesture of face-saving. Marshal Zhang Xueliang, flying in his own plane, went with the Generalissimo to the capital to await punishment. 4. Point, counterpoint. During the next 3 months, most of the political involutions created at Xi'an were completely unravelled, and in the end the scene was radically altered. Great conquests were made and victories won. Great losses and retreats were recorded too, but the duels fought were like those in a Chinese theatre between two warriors of old. They fling out blood-curdling yells, viciously slashing the air but never actually touching each other. In the end, after the loser has acknowledged his demise by languidly draping himself on the floor for a moment, he pulls himself together and stalks from the stage under his own locomotion, a dignified walking corpse. Such was the fascinating shadow boxing that went on at Nanjing. Everybody won, and only history was cheated of a victim. Blushing with shame, I have followed you to the capital for the appropriate punishment I deserve, so as to vindicate discipline, said Zhang Xueliang to the Generalissimo, immediately after reaching Nanjing. Due to my lack of virtue and defects in my training of subordinates, gallantly responds Jiang, an unprecedented revolt broke out. Now that you have expressed repentance, I will request the central authorities to adopt suitable measures of rehabilitation of the situation. And what were the rehabilitation measures? How superbly all acts of severity were commuted by acts of consolation, how fine the adjustment of punishment and compensation. Here was the work of a master in the strategy of compromise, of perfect knowledge of how to split the difference between what Chinese call yu shi wu ming, reality without the name, and yu ming wu shi, the name without reality. As Jiang's first move returning to Nanjing, he issued a long statement confessing his inability to prevent the revolt and his failure as premier. He immediately ordered the withdrawal of all government troops from Xianxi, thus fulfilling his promise to prevent civil war, and offered his resignation. He was to repeat it the traditional 3 times. In reality, he took his resignation no more seriously than did his government, for on December the 29th he called an emergency meeting of the Standing Committee of the Central Executive Committee and requested his highest organ of the Kuomintang to do 4 important things. To hand over to the Military Affairs Commission, of which he was chairman, the punishment of Zhang Xueliang, to delegate to the Military Affairs Commission the settlement of the Northwest problem, to terminate military operations against the rebels, and to abolish punitive expedition headquarters which had been set up during Jiang's absence to attack Xi'an. His recommendations were obeyed. On December 31st, Zhang Xueliang was sentenced by tribunal, at which Jiang was not present, to 10 years imprisonment and deprivation of civil rights for 5 years. On the following day, he was pardoned. And all the time, he was the personal guest of Jiang Kai-Shek's brother-in-law and recent envoy to Xi'an, TV Sun. On January the 6th, the Generalissimo's Xi'an headquarters for bandit suppression, anti-communist campaign, was abolished. 2 days later, it was already known that the skids were under Japanese-speaking, Japanese-educated Foreign Minister Zhang Jun, important leader of the political science clique in the Kuomintang. Zhang Jun had been the principal target of the Northwest in its charges of pro-Japanese officials at Nanjing. He was replaced by Dr. Wang Zhonghui, British-educated barrister and a leader of the Omei Pai, the anti-Japanese European-American clique of Kuomintang politicians, whom the Northwest junta regarded with favour. Again at Jiang's request, a plenary session of the Kuomintang Central Executive was summoned, for February the 15th. In the past, its functions had been easily predictable, and confined to legalising important changes in party policy decided in advance by the ruling cliques, which in coalition were the Jiang Kai-Shek dictatorship. What were the important changes of policy now to be introduced? Hundreds of resolutions were prepared for presentation to that august body. The great majority dealt with the national salvation. During January and early February, Jiang Kai-Shek took sick leave. He retired with Zhang Xueliang to rest in the Generalissimo's country home near Fenghua, his native place at Zhejiang. His first resignation rejected, Jiang repeated it. Meanwhile, ostensibly freed from official duties, he had complete command of the settlement of the Northwest issue, complete control of the conversations going on with the Dongbei, Xibei, and Red Army commanders. Zhang Xueliang, in disgrace, was at his side, still a virtual prisoner. On February the 10th, the Central Executive Committee of the Communist Party addressed to the national government at Nanjing and to the third plenary session a historic telegram. It congratulated the government on the peaceful settlement of the Xi'an affair, and on the impending peaceful unification of the country. To the plenary session it proposed 4 important changes in policies: to end civil war, to guarantee freedom of speech, press and assembly, and to release political prisoners, to invoke a national plan of resistance to Japanese aggression, and to return to the three principles of Dr. Sun Yat-sen's will. If these proposals were adopted in form or in substance, the Communists stated they were prepared, for the purpose of hastening national unification and resistance to Japan, to suspend all attempts to overthrow the government and to adopt the following policies. 1. Change the name of the Red Army to the National Revolutionary Army, and place it under the command of Jiang Kai-Shek's Military Affairs Commission. 2. Change the name of the Soviet government to the Special Area Government of the Republic of China. 3. Realize a completely democratic, representative form of government within the Soviet districts. And 4. Suspend the policy of land confiscation and concentrate the efforts of the people on the tasks of national salvation, that is, anti-Nipponism. But the plenary session, when it convened on February the 15th, took no formal notice of the bandits' telegram. There was much more important business to be accomplished. Jiang Kai-shek in his first speech to the session once more recounted in complete, and for him, impassioned utterance, the whole story of his captivity in Xi'an. Dramatically, he described how he refused to sign any pledge to carry out the rebels' demands. He told also how the rebels were converted to his own point of view and were moved to tears by the revelations of patriotism in his confiscated diary, and not until he had said all this did he at last, in a very offhand and contemptuous manner, submit the rebels' 8 demands to the session. Reiterating its complete confidence in the Generalissimo, the session rejected his third resignation, condemned Zhang Xueliang, and just as casually and contemptuously rejected the impertinent demands. Meanwhile, however, in its well-trained way, the Central Executive Committee was accomplishing things on its own initiative. Significant above everything else, perhaps, was the opening statement of Wang Jingwei, second only to Jiang Kai-shek in party leadership. For the first time since the beginning of the anti-Japanese wars, Comrade Wang made a speech in which he did not say that internal pacification, eradication of communism, was the most important problem before the country, in which he did not repeat his famous phrase, resistance after unification. The foremost question before the country now, he said, was recovery of the lost territories. Moreover, the session actually adopted resolutions to begin by recovering East Hebei and Northern Chaha, and abolishing the Japan-made autonomous Hebei-Chaha Council. Of course, that did not mean that Nanjing was to launch a war against Japan. Its significance was simply that further Japanese military aggression in China would meet with armed resistance from Nanjing. But that was a real leap forward. Second, the CEC, again on the Premier's recommendation, decided to convene on November the 12th the long-delayed People's Congress, which was supposed to inaugurate democracy in China. More important, the Standing Committee was authorized to revise the organic laws of the Congress to increase representation of all groups. The Generalissimo, through Wang Jingwei again, announced that the second great problem before the nation was the speedy realization of democracy. Finally, on the last day of the session, Jiang Kai-shek made a statement in which he promised greater liberty of speech to all but traitors. He said nothing about the intellectual bandits. He also promised the release of political prisoners who repent. Very quietly, an order went out to the press that no longer were the epithets Red Bandit and Communist Bandit to be used. A few prisons began to pour out a trickle of their less important victims. Then, as if in afterthought, on February the 21st, last day of the historic session, a long manifesto was issued, ostensibly to denounce the Communists. The history of 10 years of crime and vandalism was recapitulated. Was it not obvious that any talk of reconciliation with brigands, thieves, and murderers was out of the question? But all that explosion of wind, it turned out, was actually preparation for the terms of peace, which, to the extreme distaste of Tories who still opposed peace at any price, concluded the manifesto. What were these proposals? The session offered the Communists a chance to make a new start in life on 4 conditions. 1. Abolition of the Red Army and its incorporation into the National Army. 2. Dissolution of the Soviet Republic. 3. Cessation of communist propaganda that was diametrically opposed to Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles. And 4. Abandonment of the class struggle. Thus, though phrased in terms of surrender instead of cooperation, the Kuomintang had accepted the Reds' basis for negotiation of a reconciliation. Note that those terms still left the Reds in possession of their little autonomous state, their own army, their organizations, their party, and their maximum program for the future. Or so at least the Reds could hope, and so indeed they did. For on March the 15th, the Communist Party, the Soviet government, and the Red Army issued a long manifesto requesting the opening of negotiations with Nanjing. What was the purpose of all these complex maneuvers by Jiang? Obviously, they were skillfully interwoven in such a manner as to conciliate the opposition without weakening the prestige of either himself or of Nanjing. Read in their proper sequence, his orders and statements in the resolutions of the plenary session showed that he partly satisfied the political demands of all groups of the opposition, just enough to shatter their solidarity and resolution in defying him, but not enough to cause a revolt in the Kuomintang. Civil war had been stopped, and it was clear that Nanjing had at last shouldered the task of armed resistance to Japan. Promises of greater political freedom had been made, and a definite date had been set for the realization of democracy. Finally, a formula had been proposed by which the Kuomintang and the Communists might at least live together in armed truce, if not in cooperation. At the same time, the government had nominally rejected the rebels' demands and the Communists' proposal for cooperation. It was all very wonderful. One should not fail to note that these conciliatory gestures were forced through by Jiang Kai-Shek in the face of considerable antagonism to them in Nanjing, and at the conclusion of a terrific personal shock which might have embittered or unbalanced a man less gifted with foresight, and hastened him to precipitate actions of revenge, which in fact Jiang's outraged followers in Nanjing demanded. But Jiang was shrewder than they. It was real genius of political strategy that he did not ignore the promises made in Xi'an, that he took no immediate overt revenge against his captors, that he tactfully employed a policy combining just the right weight of threat with the necessary softening of confession. In that way, he eventually succeeded in breaking up the Northwest Bloc, his first objective, and peacefully transferred the Dongbei army from Shaanxi into Anhui and Henan, while the Xibei army of General Yang Hucheng was reorganized under the central command. In February, Nanjing troops were able to occupy Xi'an and its environs without disturbance or opposition, and in the following month, with his guns at their frontiers, Jiang opened negotiations with the Communists. 5. Old Lang Syne? During the Xi'an incident, the Red Army had occupied large new areas. In Shaanxi, it now held the greater part of the province, including nearly everything north of the Wei River. In their some 50 counties, an area between 60 and 70,000 square miles, or roughly twice the size of Austria, the Reds controlled the biggest single realm they had ever ruled. But it was economically poor, very limited in its possibilities of development, and thinly populated, with perhaps less than 2 million inhabitants. Strategically, the area was extremely important. From it, the Reds could, if they chose, block the tradeways to Central Asia, or perhaps later themselves make direct connections with Chinese Turkestan, Xinjiang, or Outer Mongolia. It was one of only 2 Chinese frontiers and sources of supply which Japan could not blockade. More than half of Chinese Turkestan, roughly 550,000 square miles in area, was ruled by a warlord seemingly sympathetic to the Chinese Reds and the USSR northeast of it. Outer Mongolia, another 900,000 square miles of former dependency of China, Chinese suzerainty over which was still nominally recognized even by Russia, was now definitely under the Red banner as a result of the military alliance, or Mutual Defense Pact, concluded with the USSR in 1936. These 3 regions of communist control in what could still be called Greater China were altogether about a third the size of the former Chinese Empire. Separating them from physical contact with each other were only politically ambiguous buffer districts inhabited by Mongols, Muslims, and frontiersmen, whose ties with Nanjing were fragile and against whom the threat of Japanese conquest was a deepening reality. Those areas might later on be brought into the orbit of the anti-Japanese United Front, and under Soviet influence. That would close in an immense future Red base extending from Central Asia and Mongolia into the heart of northwest China. But all that realm was backward, some of it barren steppe and desert with poor communications, and sparsely populated. It could become a decisive factor in Eastern politics only in close alliance with the advanced industrial and military bases of either the USSR or Central China, or both. Immediate gains of the Chinese Reds were confined to these categories: the cessation of civil war, a certain degree of liberalization and tolerance in Nanjing's internal politics, a stiffening toward Japan, and the partial release of the Soviet districts from their long isolation. As a result of negotiations conducted between General Zhang, the Generalissimo's envoy in Xi'an, and Zhou Enlai, the Reds' delegate there, a number of important changes took place during April, May, and June. The economic blockade was lifted. Trade relations were established between the Red districts and the outside world. More important, communications between the 2 areas were quietly restored. On the frontiers, the Red Star and the Kuomintang White Sun were crossed in symbolic union. Mail and telegraph services were partly reopened. The Reds purchased a fleet of American trucks in Xi'an and operated a bus service connecting the principal points in their region. Needed technical materials of all sorts began to pour in. Most precious to the communists were books. A new Luxian Memorial Library was established in Yan'an, and to fill it, communist comrades throughout the country sent in tons of new literature. Hundreds of young Chinese communists migrated from the great cities to Yan'an, the new Red capital, in North Shanxi. By May, over 2,000 students had been accepted for enrollment in the Red University, renamed the Anti-Japanese University, and some 500 were in the Communist Party school. Among them were Mongols, Muslims, Tibetans, Formosans, and Miao and Lolo tribesmen. Scores were also studying in a number of technical training institutes. Enthusiastic young radicals, as well as veteran party workers, rolled in from all parts of China, some walking over great distances. By July, despite the rigours of student life, there were so many applicants that no more could be accommodated. Scores were turned back to wait for another term, when the Reds prepared to receive 5,000. Many trained technicians also arrived and were given work as teachers or in the construction plan, which was now begun. In this perhaps lay the biggest immediate benefit of peace, a base in which freely to train, equip, and discipline new cadres for the ranks of the revolution and the anti-Japanese war. Of course, the Kuomintang continued strictly to supervise the Reds' connections with the outer world. There was less restriction on the movement of communists now, but there was as yet no open acknowledgement of the fact. Many parties of non-communist intellectuals also arrived in Red China to investigate conditions there, and many of them stayed on to work. In June, the Kuomintang itself secretly sent a semi-official group of delegates, headed by Xiao Hua, to visit the Red capital. They toured the Soviet districts and made appropriate refusant anti-Japanese speeches before huge mass meetings. They acclaimed the return to the anti-imperialist united front between communists and the Kuomintang. Nothing of this was allowed to appear in the Kuomintang press, however. Conditions in the Kuomintang areas also improved for the followers of Lenin. The Communist Party was still nominally illegal, but it became possible to extend its influence and widen its organization, for the oppression somewhat diminished. A small but steady stream of political prisoners was released from the jails. The special gendarmes, the blue shirts, continued their espionage on communists, but kidnappings and torture ceased. Word was sent out that blue shirt activities henceforth should centre primarily on pro-Japanese traitors. A number of the latter were arrested, and several Chinese agents in Japan's pay were reported to have been executed. By May, in an exchange of concessions, the Soviets had prepared to adopt the name of Special Area Government, and the Red Army had petitioned to be included in the National Defense Forces as the National Revolutionary Army. Great all-China meetings of party and Red Army delegates were called in May and June. Decisions were made on measures by which the new policies calling for cooperation with the Kuomintang could be realized. At these meetings, the portraits of Lenin, Marx, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Zhu De, and other Red leaders appeared beside those of Jiang Kai-Shek and Sun Yat-sen. The most important changes in Red policy were the cessation of the practice of confiscation of the landlord's land, the cessation of anti-Nanjing, anti-Kuomintang propaganda, and the promise of equal rights and the voting franchise to all citizens, regardless of their class origin. Cessation of land confiscation did not mean the return of land to the landlords in areas where redistribution had already been realized, but was an agreement to abandon the practice in districts newly bought under communist control. On his side, Generalissimo Jiang agreed to consider the Soviet districts part of the national defense area and pay accordingly. The first payment to the Reds, $500,000, was delivered shortly after Jiang Kai-shek's return to Nanjing. Some of the Kuomintang money was used to convert Soviet currency, to buy manufactures for their cooperatives, and to purchase much-needed equipment. The exact monthly allowance from Nanjing was still under negotiation, as indeed was the whole definitive working agreement for future cooperation, while the storm of Japanese invasion was gathering in the north. In June, the Generalissimo sent his private plane to Xi'an for Zhou Enlai, the Reds' chief delegate, who flew to Xueliang, China's summer capital. There, Zhou held further conversations with Jiang Kai-shek and members of the cabinet. Among points discussed was the Communists' demand for representation in the People's Congress. The Congress scheduled to adopt a democratic constitution in November. It was reported that an agreement was reached whereby the special area would be permitted to elect 9 delegates on a regional basis. However, these delegates in all probability would not be known as communists. Nanjing had not openly acknowledged the so-called remarriage. It preferred to regard the relationship rather as the annexation of a concubine whose continence had yet to be proved, and one about which, for diplomatic reasons, the less said outside family circles, the better. But even this furtive mésalliance was an astounding and open defiance of Japan, unthinkable a few months previously. Meanwhile, Japan's own offer, through matchmaker Hirota, of a respectable anti-red marriage with Nanjing was finally spurned. In this was perhaps the last and definite indication that Nanjing's foreign policy had undergone a fundamental change. All that seemed an utterly incomprehensible denouement to many an observer, and serious errors were made in its analysis. After a decade of the fiercest kind of civil war, red and white suddenly burst into Auld Lang Syne. What was the meaning of it? Had the Reds turned white? Had the Whites turned red? Neither one. But surely someone must have won and someone lost. Yes, China had won. Japan had lost. For it seemed that a final decision in the profoundly complicated internal struggle had been postponed once more by the intervention of a third ingredient, Japanese imperialism. 6. Red Horizons. There was an accomplished social scientist named Lenin. History generally, he wrote, and the history of revolutions in particular, is always richer in content, more varied, more many-sided, more lively and subtle than the best parties and the most class-conscious vanguards of the most advanced class imagine. This is understandable, because the best vanguards express the class consciousness, the will, the passion, the fantasy of tens of thousands, while the revolution is made, at the moment of its climax and exertion of all human capabilities, by the class consciousness, the will, the passion, and the fantasy of tens of millions who are urged on by the very acutest class struggle. In what ways had Chinese history proved richer in content, more varied, more many-sided, more lively and subtle than the communist theoreticians foresaw a decade or so ago? To be specific, why had the Red Army failed to win power in China? In attempting an answer, one had to recall again and keep clearly in mind the communist conception of the Chinese Revolution and its main objectives. The communists said that the Chinese capitalist class was not a true bourgeoisie, but a colonial bourgeoisie. It was a comprador class, an excrescence of the foreign finance and monopoly capitalism which it primarily served. It was too weak to lead the revolution. It could achieve the conditions of its own freedom only through the fulfillment of the anti-imperialist movement, the elimination of foreign domination. But only the workers and peasants could lead such a revolution to its final victory, and the communists intended that the workers and peasants should not turn over the fruits of that victory to the neo-capitalists, whom they were thus to release, as had happened in France, Germany, Italy, everywhere in fact, except in Russia. Instead, they should retain power through a kind of NEP period, a brief epoch of controlled capitalism, and then a period of state capitalism, followed at last by a speedy transition into socialist construction, with the help of the USSR. All that was indicated quite clearly in fundamental laws of the Chinese Soviet Republic. The aim of the driving out of imperialism and destroying the Kuomintang, repeated Mao Zedong in 1934, is to unify China, to bring the bourgeois democratic revolution to fruition, and to make it possible to turn this revolution into a higher stage of socialist revolution. This is the task of the Soviet. At the apex of the Great Revolution, 1925 to 1927, there was present the necessary revolutionary mood among both the peasant masses and the proletariat, but there were many differences from the situation which had produced the Russian Revolution. One of these was very great. Survivals of feudalism were even more pronounced in Russia than in China, but China was a semi-colonial country, an oppressed nation, while Russia was an imperialist country, an oppressor nation. In the Russian Revolution, the proletariat had to conquer only a single class, its own native bourgeois imperialist class, while the Chinese Revolution had to contend with an indigenous enemy of dual personality, both its own nascent bourgeoisie and the entrenched interests of foreign imperialism. Theoretically, in the beginning, the Chinese communists expected this dual nature of their enemy to be offset by the dual nature of their own assault, which would be aided by their proletarian allies of the world and the toilers of the USSR. Nearly half of all industrial workers of China huddled in Shanghai under the gunboats of the world's great powers. In Tianjin, Qingdao, Shanghai, Hangzhou, Hong Kong, Kowloon, and other spheres of imperialism were probably 3/4 of all the industrial workers of China. Shanghai provided the classic prototype. Here were British, American, French, Japanese, Italian, and Chinese soldiers, sailors, and police, all the forces of world imperialism combined with native gangsterism and the comprador bourgeoisie, the most degenerate elements of Chinese society, cooperating in wielding the truncheon over the unarmed workers. Rights of freedom of speech, assembly, or organization were denied these workers. Mobilization of the industrial proletariat in China for political action was hardly conceivable as long as the dual system of native and foreign policing power was maintained. Only once in history had it been broken, in 1927, when for a few days Jiang Kai-Shek made use of the workers to secure his victory over the northern warlords, but immediately afterwards they were suppressed in one of the demoralizing bloodbaths of history, with the sanctification of the foreign powers and the financial help of foreign capitalists. The Nanjing regime could and did count upon the security of the industrial bases held by the foreign powers in the treaty ports, and on their troops, their guns, their cruisers, and their inland police, the river gunboats, and on their wealth, their press, their propaganda, and their spies. It did not matter that instances of direct participation of these powers in actual warfare against the Red Army were few. They occurred on the occasions when such action was necessary, but their chief services were rendered by policing the industrial workers, by furnishing Nanjing with munitions and aeroplanes, and by entering into conspiracy which complacently denied the very existence of civil war by the simple device of calling the communists bandits, so that the embarrassing question of non-intervention committees, as in the case of Spain, was never even allowed to arise. The communist leaders were obliged to fall back on the rural districts, where the Soviet movement, while retaining the aims and ideology of proletarian class consciousness, in practice assumed a peasant-based national social revolution. In the rural areas, the Reds hoped eventually to build up sufficient strength to be able to attack urban bases where foreign influence was less firmly established, and later, with the help they hoped of the world proletariat, to divest the citadels of foreign power in the treaty ports. But while the imperialist powers were the objective allies of the Chinese bourgeoisie against communism, the assistance that communists expected from the world proletariat failed to materialize. Although in the Communist International Program it was clearly recognized that successful proletarian movements in semi-colonial countries such as China will be possible only if direct support is obtained from the countries in which the proletarian dictatorship is established, i.e. the USSR, the Soviet Union in fact did not extend to the Chinese comrades the promised assistance and support of the proletarian dictatorship in any degree commensurate with their need. On the contrary, the great help amounting to intervention which the Soviet Union gave to Jiang Kai-Shek until 1927 had the objective effect of assisting him into power, although at the same time it helped create the revolutionary opposition in the Red Army movement that arose later on. Of course, the rendering of direct aid to the Chinese Communists after 1927 became quite incompatible with the position adopted by the USSR, for that would have been to jeopardize by the danger of international war the whole program of socialist construction in one country. Nevertheless, it must be noted that the influence of this factor on the Chinese Revolution was very great. Deprived of material help from an outside ally, the Chinese Communists continued their struggle alone for the hegemony of the bourgeois revolution, believing that deep changes in internal and international politics would release new forces in their favor. They were quite mistaken. The Kuomintang's power remained relatively secure in the great urban centers for the reasons mentioned, but in the villages it developed only very slowly. Paradoxically and dialectically, the rural anemia of the bourgeoisie was traceable to the same source as Nanjing's strength in the cities, to foreign imperialism. For while imperialism was eager enough to cooperate in preventing or suppressing urban insurrection, or possibilities of it, at the same time it was objectively engaged, chiefly through Japan, the focus of the system's point of greatest stress in the Far East, in collecting heavy fees for this service, in the form of new annexations of territory, Manchuria, Jehol, Chahar, and East Hebei, new concessions and new wealth belonging to China. The great burdens placed upon the Nanjing government by the newest phase of imperialist aggression made it impossible for the Kuomintang to introduce in the rural areas the necessary capitalist reforms, commercial banking, improved communications, centralized taxing and policing power, etc., fast enough to suppress the spread of rural discontent and peasant rebellion. By carrying out a land revolution, the Reds were able to satisfy the demands of a substantial peasant following, take the leadership of part of rural China, and even build several powerful bases on an almost purely agrarian economy. But meanwhile they could grow no stronger in the cities, on which their enemies continued to be based. In this situation, the Communists argued that the Kuomintang's attacks on the Soviets prevented the Chinese people from fulfilling their mission of national liberation in driving out the Japanese, and that the Kuomintang's own unwillingness to defend the country proved the bankruptcy of its leadership. But the enraged nationalist retorted that the Communists' attempts to overthrow the government prevented them from resisting Japan, while the continued practice of red banditry in the interior, despite the grave national crisis, slowed the realization of internal reforms. And here in essence was the peculiar stalemate, the fundamental importance of this period of the Chinese Revolution. Over this decade, the imperialist pressure gradually became so severe, the Japanese price for the protection of the interests of the Chinese compradors in the cities became so excessive that it tended to neutralize the class antagonisms between the Kuomintang, the party of the bourgeoisie and the landlords, and the Gongchandan, the party of the workers and peasants. It was precisely because of this, and because of the immediate events described in the foregoing chapters, that the Kuomintang and the Communist Party were thus able, after a decade of ceaseless warfare, to reunite in a synthesis expressed in terms of their essential unity on the higher plane of common antagonism against Japanese imperialism. This unity was not stable, it was not permanent. It might break up again whenever the internal denials outweighed the external ones, but it began a new era. At the end of a decade of class war, the Communists had been forced to abandon temporarily their thesis that only under the hegemony of the proletariat could the bourgeois democratic movement develop. Instead, it was acknowledged that a union of all classes could achieve those purposes. Its practical significance was the clear recognition of the present leadership, which was here synonymous with power, of the Kuomintang in the National Revolution. For the Reds, it had certainly to be considered a great retreat, as Mao Zedong had frankly admitted from the days in Jiangxi, when they fought to consolidate the workers' and peasants' dictatorship, to extend his dictatorship to the whole country, and to mobilize, organize, and arm the Soviets and the masses to fight in this revolutionary war. The armed struggle for immediate power had ceased. Communist slogans became these: to support the central government, to hasten peaceful unification under Nanjing, to realize bourgeois democracy, and to organize the whole nation to oppose Japan. Practical gains resulting from these concessions have already been discussed, but what guarantees had the Communists that these gains could be held? What guarantees were there that the internal peace would be maintained, that the promised democracy would be realized, that a policy of resistance to Japan would last? In such periods it is necessary, wrote Lenin, to combine the strictest loyalty to the ideas of communism with the ability to make all necessary compromises, to tack, to make agreements, zigzags, retreats, and so on. And thus, although among the Chinese communists there was a great shift in strategy, still they believed it was now possible to conduct the contest in a much more favourable atmosphere than in the past. There had been an exchange of concessions, as Mao Zedong said, and an exchange to which there are definite limits. He continued, "The Communist Party retains the leadership on problems in the Soviet districts and the Red Army, and retains its independence and freedom of criticism in its relations with the Kuomintang. On these points no concessions can be made. The Communist Party will never abandon its aims of socialism and communism. It will still pass through the stage of democratic revolution of the bourgeoisie to attain the stages of socialism and communism. The Communist Party retains its own program and its own policies. Quite clearly, the Kuomintang would utilize to the fullest extent the benefits of the new communist policy toward itself. With Nanjing's authority recognized by the only political party in China capable of challenging it, Jiang Kai-Shek would continue to extend his military and economic power in peripheral areas where warlord influence was still strong, areas such as Guangxi, Yunnan, Guizhou, and Sichuan. Improving his military position all around the Reds, he would meanwhile extract political concessions from them in return for his temporary toleration. Eventually, by skillful combination of political and economic tactics, he hoped so to weaken them politically that when the moment was right for the final demand of their complete surrender, which he undoubtedly still aspired to secure, he might isolate the Red Army, fragmentize it on the basis of internal political dissensions, and deal with the recalcitrant remnant as a purely regional military problem. The Reds were under no delusions about that. Likewise, they were under no delusions that the promise of democracy could be fulfilled without a continued active opposition of their own. No party of dictatorship in history ever yielded up its power, except under the heaviest pressure, and the Kuomintang would prove no exception. The achievement of even the measure of democracy now in prospect would have been impossible without the 10-year presence of an armed opposition. Indeed, without that opposition, no democracy would have been necessary, and no state power with the degree of centralization which we now began to witness in China would have been conceivable. For the growth of popular government was, like the maturing of the modern state itself, a manifestation of the need for power and mechanism in which to attempt to reconcile contradictions inherent in capitalist society, the basic class antagonisms. These contradictions were not diminishing in China, but rapidly increasing, and to the extent that they sharpened, the state had to take recognition of them. The achievement of internal peace itself made it inevitable, if that internal peace were to last, that Nanjing reflect a wider representation of social stratifications. That did not mean that there was any likelihood of the Kuomintang quietly signing its own death warrant by genuinely realizing bourgeois democracy, and by permitting the Communist Party to compete with it in open election campaigning, for it was quite possible that the vote of the peasantry alone would have given the Communists an overwhelming majority, although that is what the Communists and other parties demanded, and would continue to agitate for. But it did mean that some recognition of peasant demands would have to be made by the tiny minority which monopolized the state economy and policing power. The tentative concessions of representation of the Soviet areas in the National Congress was an indication of that. The centripetal spread of economic, political, and social interests, the process of so-called unification, the very measures which created the system, at the same time required for their own preservation, that ever-widening groups be focused in the centre of an attempt to resolve the insoluble, the deepening conflict of class interests. And the more Nanjing tended to represent different and wider class interests throughout the country, the nearer it came to achieving democracy, the more it was forced to seek a solution of self-survival by resistance to the increasingly greedy demands of Japan. The guarantee of increased communist influence, the guarantee against future annihilation campaigns, therefore was seen by the communists to be inherent in the organic economic, social, and political relationships of the country, precisely those formations which had resulted in the present situation. These were, first of all, a wide popular demand among both armed and unarmed masses for continued internal unity, for improved livelihood, for popular government, and for resistance to Japan in a common struggle for national freedom. Second, the Communist Party's guarantees lay in the leadership it could continue to give to the movement for those demands throughout the country, and in the actual military and political fighting strength of the Communist Party. In the spring of 1937, the temporary diminution in Japanese pressure on China, a pause in the invasion of Inner Mongolia, the opening of Anglo-Japanese conversations for cooperation in China, and the hopes of the British government to mediate a Sino-Japanese agreement and a fundamental peace in the Far East, caused some people to wonder whether the communist estimate of the political scene was not in error. Was it not reckless gambling to pivot a strategy on the central inevitability of an early Sino-Japanese war? Now that internal peace was established in China, now that the Reds had ceased their attempts to overthrow the Kuomintang, Japan was really turning a conciliatory face to Nanjing, it was argued. Japan's imperialists realized that they had pushed the Chinese bourgeoisie too far and too fast along the road of surrender, with the result that China's class war was cancelled in the universal hatred of Japan. They now saw the wisdom of enforcing a new and friendly policy toward the Chinese bourgeoisie in order to renew its freedom to engage in internal conflict. And such a Tokyo-Nanjing rapprochement would destroy the communist political influence, which was too heavily based on the Kang-ri, the Resist Japan movement. But history in flood must seek its outlets according to the laws of dynamics. It cannot be forced back into its pre-flood channels. Japan could not revert to a static policy in China, even though Japan's ablest leaders realized the imperative necessity for a halt. And this red prescience seemed fully vindicated on July the 8th by the Liu Guoqiao incident. Japanese troops holding midnight maneuvers, quite illegally, on Chinese territory at the town of Wanping, about 10 miles west of Beijing, claimed to have been fired on by Chinese railway guards. The incident gave the Japanese army the pretext. By the middle of July, the Japanese had rushed some 10,000 troops into the Beijing-Tianjin area and had made new imperialist demands, capitulation to which would have meant virtually the acceptance of a Japanese protectorate in North China. The communist conception of that situation, and of the kindling events which it must set in motion, was that the growing pressure of the whole nation for resistance, not only here but everywhere that new acts of aggression occurred, would oblige Jiang Kai-shek's regime to take a position in which, if Japan did not reverse her policies and make amends for the past, there was no way out but war. And the communists continued to interpret such a war not only as a struggle for national independence, but as a revolutionary movement, because to defeat imperialism in China means the destruction of one of its most powerful bases, and because the victory of the Chinese Revolution itself will correspond with the victory of the Chinese people against Japanese aggression, said Mao Zedong. According to Mao Zedong's analysis of the breaking point politico-economic tension in Japan, China, and throughout the world, This settlement in human destinies could not be delayed for any important length of time. The Reds foresaw that in this war it would become necessary to arm, equip, train, and mobilize tens of millions of people in a struggle which could serve the dual surgical function of removing the external tumor of imperialism and the internal cancer of class oppression. Such a war, as they conceived it, could be conducted only by the broadest mobilization of the masses, by the development of a highly politicized army, and such a war could be won only under the most advanced revolutionary leadership. It could be initiated by the bourgeoisie. It would be completed only by the revolutionary workers and peasants. Once the people were really armed and organized on an immense scale, the communists would do everything possible to establish a decisive victory over Japan. They would march with the Kuomintang as long as it led the resistance. But they would be prepared to take over this leadership whenever the government faltered, turned defeatist, and exhibited a willingness to submit to Japan, a tendency which they anticipated would appear soon after the first great losses of the war. Probably the Nanjing regime fully understood those objectives of the communists, and hence they would seek out every possible road of compromise. They would, if they could, avoid the internal consequences, make further concessions to Japan, at least until the odds seemed very greatly in favor of the regime's ability not only to enter a war with power, but to emerge from it with that power still intact, and with the internal revolution still in abeyance. But the communists were sufficiently content with their own analysis of the course of history behind them to be satisfied with the chart of direction which they had chosen for the voyage ahead, through the events which would compel Nanjing to make a stand for its own survival. They foresaw that Nanjing might continue to vacillate, that Japan might continue to feint and maneuver in a myriad of ways, until the utmost agony of antagonism was reached between the interests of Japanese imperialism and the national interests of China externally, and between the Chinese and Japanese masses and their landlord gentry rulers internally, until the moment when all the physical restraints and oppressions became utterly intolerable. The barriers of history broke down, the mighty catastrophe bred by imperialism was set loose, Frankenstein-like, to destroy imperialism, and la deluge swept forward. Thus capitalism digs its own grave. Thus imperialism would destroy imperialism, in that only a great imperialist war would release the forces that could bring to the Asian masses the arms, the training, the political experience, the freedom of organization, and the mortal weakening of the internal policing power which were necessary accessories for any conceivably successful revolutionary ascent to power in the relatively near future. Whether or not, even then, the armed masses were likely to follow communist leadership with final success depended upon many variable and unpredictable factors. Internal factors first of all, but such factors also as in the policies in the east of America, Great Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, and to the very greatest extent the policies of the USSR. After that, I believed, was the contour of the communist picture of the future as China waited for Japan to strike. One might not follow all of it, but this at least seems certain, that what Lenin had written more than 20 years before was still true. Whatever may be the fate of the great Chinese Revolution, against which various civilized hyenas are now sharpening their teeth, no forces in the world will restore to the old serfdom in Asia, nor erase from the face of the earth the heroic democracy of the popular masses in the Asiatic and semi-Asiatic countries. And another thing seemed equally certain. Neither could the democratic socialist ideas for which tens of thousands of youths had already died in China, nor the energies behind them, be destroyed. The movement for social revolution in China might suffer defeats, might temporarily retreat, might for a time seem to languish, might make wide changes in tactics to fit immediate necessities and aims, might even for a period be submerged, be forced underground, but it would not only continue to mature in one mutation or another, it would eventually win, simply because, as this book proves if it proves anything, the basic conditions which had given it birth carried within themselves the dynamic necessity for its triumph. Epilogue, 1944. What had happened to the Chinese of this book in 7 years since the Liu Guoqiao incident, when Japan began her attempt to conquer China in July 1937? For one thing, the passage of time had vindicated the judgment of Mao Zedong and other communist leaders that the achievement of national unity for the struggle against Japan was more important than any other immediate objective of the revolutionary movement. In this perspective, the Xi'an incident now loomed as a happening of decisive importance in contemporary Chinese history. Few remembered how close China came to adherence to the Anti-Comintern Pact, just before the Xi'an affair, but it was now quite clear that after it there came the final parting of ways between Tokyo and Nanjing. Xi'an made certain that China would be on the anti-fascist side of the coming world struggle. In other respects, time had confirmed the validity of the ideas for which the revolutionaries whose stories were told in these passages had fought and died. It had brought immense prestige to the survivors and to their greatly increased following, during the long ordeal now drawing to a close. A revolutionary movement demands of its leader the ability to know a little ahead of anyone else what is going to happen, and in this respect, Mao Zedong had been so successful that millions of Chinese now reposed as much confidence in his judgment as in that of Jiang Kai-Shek. However they might feel about the communists and what they now represented, most Chinese would admit that Mao Zedong accurately analyzed the internal and international forces involved, and correctly depicted the general shape of events to come. Civil war did end, and the Communist Party and the Red Army not only survived, but was strengthened. Mao's suggestion that at a certain stage in the war, part of the Kuomintang would betray China and turn puppet for the Japanese was long resented, but after the defection of Wang Jingwei, deputy leader of the Kuomintang and second only to the Generalissimo, it could not be denied that Mao had intimately understood the contradictory elements in the central government. Again, Mao predicted that the war would be long and difficult, and this must be one of the few instances in history in which an advocate of armed struggle did not promise his adherents a speedy triumph. His candour disarmed in advance the kind of defeatism that preys upon shattered illusions. On the other hand, Mao helped to build up a more durable self-confidence in the nation by correctly estimating the enormous staying power guaranteed by China's own human and material resources when mobilized in a revolutionary way. And he indicated the kind of strategy and tactics which China would have to adopt to hold on until the end of the National War merged with the World War, including Japanese attacks on the British, the French, the Dutch, and the Americans, which he warned were inevitable in a period when many Europeans and Americans thought otherwise. By 1944, the Chinese Communists provided the leadership in North China for what was much the largest guerrilla organization in the world. Stretching from the Yangtze River to the Mongolian steppe, and to the mountains and rivers of southern Manchuria, thousands of villages behind the Japanese lines made up the pattern of this People's War. Its organizers were youths chiefly inspired and trained by the 18th Group Army, the combined 8th Route Army and new 4th Armies. These forces were led by Zhu De, Peng Dehuai, and other veterans of the former Red Army of China, who now had behind them an amazing record of survival and growth through 17 years of difficult civil and national war. Foreign observers who visited the guerrilla districts in 1943 estimated that behind the Japanese lines, the 18th Group Army had organized and given crude training to militia numbering around 7 million people. These were the reserves of the main fighting units. In addition, there were said to be some 12 million members of various anti-Japanese associations, which helped to clothe, feed, house, equip, and transport the regular troops, and were their eyes and ears. Official data showed partisan penetration in 455 xian, or counties, of North China, and in 52,800 villages with a population of more than 60 million. From 3/5 to 2/3 of the so-called conquered territory was in guerrilla hands most of the time. For nearly 7 years, the Japanese had been trying to exterminate these tireless enemies. 8th Route regulars numbered hardly 50,000 men in 1937, and diverted only a few divisions of Japanese troops. But that vanguard multiplied in every direction. In 1944, more than half of Japan's 350,000 troops in China proper, excluding Manchuria, and some 200,000 puppet troops, were occupied in defending fortified areas against the 18th Group Army and in fighting punitive actions against it. Japanese military reports put its strength at from 500,000 to 600,000. In every one of the provinces occupied by the Japanese, which covered an area 3 times the size of France, partisans had set up village and county councils. They had established 4 border governments in bases held throughout the war, except for brief intervals, and each of these regional governments represented liberated areas of several neighbouring provinces. These behind-the-lines regimes performed nearly all the functions of normal administration. They had their own postal system and radio communications. They published their own newspapers, magazines, and books. They maintained an extensive system of schools and enforced a reformed legal code recognizing sex equality and adult suffrage. They regulated rents, collected taxes, controlled trade and issued currency, operated industries, maintained a number of experimental farms, extended agricultural credit, had a grain rationing system, and in several places had undertaken fairly large afforestation projects. The dense perimeter held by Japanese troops in China in 1944 was already stabilized before the end of 1939. When the enemy originally moved into the conquered provinces, most of the old officials of the Kuomintang government, as well as its troops, withdrew to the west and south. Behind them, the administrative bureaucracy collapsed. In the cities, it was replaced by Japanese and their Chinese puppets, but a kind of political vacuum existed in the hinterland towns and villages, the interstices between enemy garrisons. Into that temporary vacuum moved the former Red Army of China, with arms, with teachers, and with faith in the people's strength. This movement began with the Generalissimo's acquiescence. It was made possible, first of all, as we have seen, by Marshal Zhang Xueliang's earlier detention of the Generalissimo at Xi'an, in order to persuade him to stop fighting the Reds and to unite with them against Japan. After the Japanese invaded North China, an agreement was reached which ended a decade of civil war. This provided that the Red Army should be incorporated into the national forces, that the Soviets should be abolished in favor of a government in which all classes would be represented, and that the Communists would abandon the slogans of class warfare and cease confiscating and redistributing the land. The Northern Red forces dropped the Red Flag and the Red Star, and accepted the designation 8th Route Army. Southeast of Shanghai, other Red remnants under Generals Ye Ding and Han Ying were regrouped in 1938 as the new 4th Army. Both the Kuomintang and the Gongchandan now claimed to be the legitimate heirs of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, founder of the Chinese Republic. Both supported him in the early days of the revolution. Even after 1937, however, there was no agreement over the practical application of Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles of nationalism, livelihood, and democracy. The Communists still regarded Sun as a social revolutionary and demanded a radical interpretation of his principles. Briefly, they wanted a thoroughgoing democratic revolution, with equalization of land ownership, universal suffrage, and a constitutional government establishing the people's power, by which they meant the Communist Party and ultimately a proletarian dictatorship. Since the Kuomintang still drew its chief internal support from the landlord class, it was naturally opposed to radical land reform. In general, it wanted to keep economic and political relationships intact, and to superimpose its dictatorship on the old Chinese semi-feudal structure. If it acknowledged the legality of other parties and their conflicting interpretations, especially if it conceded adult suffrage, that structure would almost certainly be overthrown. While questions of class power and the ultimate form of the state and society remained in momentary abeyance, the Communists and Nationalists at least agreed upon the principle of nationalism when Japan invaded the country. The Reds then took their military orders from the Generalissimo. In 1937, he sent them into the battle line in North China, where many Kuomintang leaders confidently expected them to be swallowed up in the Japanese drive. They did not disintegrate in that way, however, as some of the northern warlord armies did. They met the attack and were defeated in the cities, but instead of retreating or surrendering, they withdrew to the villages and hills and continued fighting. Infiltrating all the northern provinces with experienced partisan leaders and political organizers, they soon enlisted valuable reinforcements from a thickening stream of refugees fleeing from the cities. Students, workers, and various professional men and women, including intellectuals belonging to the non-communist liberal political parties, long suppressed by both the Chinese and Japanese regimes. Cut off from the rear, whole divisions of defeated Chinese troops came under Red leadership. In North China, the Mintuan lost its central direction and cohesion when nationalist regulars were driven out by Japan. Their landlord gentry paymasters fled or stayed to make deals with the Japanese, and the militia had to become puppet troops for the Japanese or flee to Jiang Kai-Shek's territory, or join the communist-led partisans. Japan served the communists by destroying or demoralizing the whole rural police power system, with which the old rural landlord gentry alliance with the urban property owners had been maintained. At the outset, it was the disintegration of that police system rather than victories over the Japanese that made possible the rapid expansion of the 8th Route Army. Their rifle power, however, steadily increased. By 1939, their strongholds had become so formidable that the Japanese were compelled to launch a full-dress offensive against them. They went on doing so semi-annually from then on. The first partisan regime entirely inside occupied territory was set up in the mountains of northeastern Shanxi, east of the Yellow River, and included areas as far north as Diehol or Inner Mongolia. Another regime, with its capital in southeastern Shanxi, directed operations in recovered territory which stretched for over 300 miles across southern Hebei and Shandong, eastward toward the Yellow Sea. There was a third border region centering in northern Jiangsu, north of Shanghai, which was controlled by the new 4th Army, with nearly 100,000 troops. A 4th regional government was established in the mountainous country north of the Yangtze River above Hankou, where the borders of Anhui and Hubei enclosed the southern extremity of Henan. Political and military methods used to organize the people borrowed heavily from the pattern developed in the old Soviet districts of northern Shanxi. After the Soviet government was abolished in 1937, a Shanxi, Gansu, Ningxia border area government took its place, and the town of Yan'an, the so-called mother of the Chinese partisans, became its capital. I revisited Yan'an in 1939 after the new government was established. It remained until 1944, the last trip made there by any foreign newspaper correspondent, for soon afterwards the region was cut off by the Kuomintang's military blockade. On the other side of the Yellow River, behind Japanese lines, the organization of the social, political, and economic life was naturally more difficult than in Yan'an, but in general the goals, if not always the degree of success achieved, were comparable. Although newspaper correspondents in Free China were not able to investigate the Shanxi and Hebei areas, the various foreigners who escaped from the Japanese in Beijing and made their way southward across the guerrilla territory gave fairly complete pictures of the system which prevailed. Among these observers was Professor William Band of the famous American missionary institution Yanjing University, whom I knew when I lectured there in 1934 to 1935. Another was Professor Michael Lindsay, also of Yanjing, whose report of conditions there was published in Amerasia magazine in 1944. The most comprehensive account of the partisan areas to reach the outside world for some time, it was released for publication by the author's father, A.D. Lindsay, Master of Balliol College, Oxford. According to Professor Lindsay, the partisan governments were elected from candidates nominated directly by the people and their organizations. The Chinese partisans aimed to establish a united front of all groups, and hence the Communist Party limited its own members to 1/3 of the total of any elected body. This peculiar policy was vigorously enforced, according to Lindsay. The purpose was to give representation in the government to both landowners, except absentee landlords, and merchants, but above all to develop political leaders among the poor peasants and workers. It was education in democracy by practicing democracy, according to the partisan leaders. In the mass organizations there were no limitations on communist leadership, however, and these organizations were the guerrillas' sinew and life. They included separate unions or associations for farmers, workers, youth, children, and women, and membership in each ran into the millions. Most important of all such organizations were the Self-Defense Corps, the militia, and the Young Vanguards. These were crude but basic military organizations which locally supported the 18th Group Army's main forces. G. Mantell Hall, former manager of the National City Bank in Beijing, who was the last American to escape from the Japanese across the partisan areas, told me that there was simply no other way he could explain the success of the partisan leaders with the peasants, except through their own incorruptibility and honesty, their energetic patriotism, their devotion to practical democracy, their faith in the common people, and the continuous effort they made to arouse them to action and responsibility. Mutual hatred of the Japanese provided the atmosphere in which these zealots exploited the people's patriotism, but side by side with political reforms went economic and social changes. In the case of women, the enforcement of laws like monogamy, freedom of marriage and the age of consent, free education, and suffrage at the age of 18 won a surprising response. Professor Lindsay said there were over 3 million members of the women's organizations in the partisan areas. Many women had been elected to village and town councils, and large numbers of young girls carried serious political and military responsibilities. The primary school system operated widely in all the permanent guerrilla bases, and education was free and compulsory in theory if, because of poverty, seldom attainable in fact. Yet in a few places as high as 80% of the younger children of school age were literate. The basic reform was a drastic reduction in land rent. Land of absentee landlords was tilled in common. The aim was to cultivate all cultivable land. Taxes were collected mainly in grain and were kept at about 10% of those demanded by the Japanese. Consumer, marketing, and industrial cooperatives were widespread. Lindsay stated that there were over 4,000 cooperatives in Shanxi and 5,000 in central Hebei alone. Unimaginable hardships accompanied partisan organization at every step. While it is true the Japanese failed to destroy the partisan forces or to stop their increase, they carried out literally thousands of large and small-scale punitive expeditions against them. They looted and burned thousands of villages, raped the womenfolk and slaughtered countless civilians, in a terror aimed to wipe out all thought of resistance. The guerrillas always found ways to overcome the demoralizing effects of these tactics, but not without sacrifices as bitter as any endured in Russia. It was true that the Japanese were still unable to control any village much beyond the range of their garrisons along North China's railways and roads. But it was also true that their fortified points had greatly increased and could now be seized only at a heavy cost. So much for background. How did all this affect American plans to defeat Japan through China? After all, you saved the Kuomintang, a Chinese intellectual in Chongqing told me when I returned to China in 1942 to 1943 as a war correspondent for the Saturday Evening Post. It is your baby now, and you cannot avoid responsibility for its actions. He meant simply that American money, arms, and economic aid were given to the Kuomintang authorities without any conditions concerning policies pursued inside China. American government representatives had several times made it clear to Chongqing that we would disapprove of a renewal of civil strife during the joint war against Japan, but Americans had not gone beyond that, nor sought to have the blockade lifted against the partisan areas. Chongqing established its blockade against the 18th Group Army when Kuomintang party leaders became increasingly alarmed by the Communist success in recovering control of areas behind the Japanese lines. The Generalissimo described their activity as illegal occupation of the national territory. The Kuomintang's War Areas Political and Party Affairs Commission took the position that all the guerrilla administrations were illegal and should be abolished, to await the re-establishment of the Kuomintang system. In 1940, some Kuomintang troops engaged the rear echelon of the new Fourth Army while it was moving from its base south of the Yangtze River, near Shanghai, to an area entirely behind the Japanese lines to which it was assigned by the Generalissimo. It was apparently a surprise attack, and the partisans were reportedly outnumbered 8-1. The little detachment of about 4,000 was not a combat unit, and it was easily encircled and destroyed. General Ye Ding, the commander of the new Fourth Army, who was himself not a communist, was wounded and taken prisoner, and General Han Ying, the field commander, was killed together with many of his staff, some doctors and nurses of the medical battalions, a number of convalescent wounded soldiers, some cadets, men and women students, and some industrial cooperative workers attached to the army. The incident failed to liquidate the new Fourth Army, whose main forces were already north of the Yangtze River engaging Japanese troops there, but it was the effective end of the nationalist-communist collaboration in the field and the beginning of an open struggle for leadership in the joint war against Japan. The Generalissimo ruled that the incident was caused by the new Fourth's insubordination, and thenceforth withdrew all aid not only from that army but also from the Eighth Route. For some months previous to the tragedy, no part of the 18th Group Army had been paid. From this time on, they not only received no pay or ammunition, but were blockaded by a ring of strong government forces from access to supplies in Free China, which they might have purchased or received as gifts from the people. Ironically enough, the Kuomintang troops enforcing this blockade were largely supplied by Soviet Russia. There were two group armies, the 37th and the 38th, engaged exclusively in the blockading enterprise. American officers in 1942 suggested that they were needed in the campaign to recover Burma, but Chongqing considered their policing role in the northwest of greater importance, and there they remained. All such facts were known to Americans in China, but probably few at home realized that our Lend-Lease aid went exclusively to the Kuomintang authorities. We remained no consular representation in Yan'an and no military liaison with the partisans. All our supplies flown over the hump into China, modern bombers and fighters, artillery, transport and ammunition, supported only the one party, of course. Financial aid sent to China by the CIO, AFL and railway brotherhoods also went exclusively to Kuomintang troops. What could be done about this internal affair of China? Our new treaty with China in 1943 renounced extraterritoriality rights and restored full sovereignty to the Chinese government. Could we now tell the present government how to run its business without being branded neo-imperialists? But inevitably, the war had already caused us to intervene in support of the Kuomintang in terms of economic and military aid. Was it not merely playing ostrich to pretend that our future economic help to China did not carry implicit political responsibilities of the gravest kind? Once Japan was defeated, would Jiang Kai-Shek then destroy the communists and their partisan allies? The Kuomintang spent 10 fruitless years in the attempt before 1937. Even with the use of American bombers and fighters on his side, the Generalissimo was not likely to secure greater success than the Japanese had against these experienced guerrilla warriors. It had become a physical impossibility for the Chongqing government to destroy this opposition in anything short of a long and bloody war, fully backed by Allied troops. By the summer of 1944, it had thus become manifest that the tiny band of youths who had raised the red flag on the lonely mountain of Jingangshan far back in 1928 had launched a demonstration which evolved into a crusade, which finally rose to the stature of a national movement of such scope that no arbiters of China's destiny could much longer deny its claims to speak for the vast multitudes of people.